Proverbs and the wisdom corpus in general, so Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, are really a practical extension of Torah in the sense that they take the theology of Deuteronomy and show what that looks like in terms of regular life. That is, in your day-to-day life as you're walking in the market and in the fields and in the city, what does it mean to live out Torah? And that these books are sort of like a practical extension of it.
Welcome back to this episode of Theologically Driven. Today we're joined by Dr. Kyle Dunham to talk about canonical closure formulas in Ecclesiastes. Before we do that, I wanted to remind you about our Rice Lecture Series coming up in March. It'll be held on March 20th at Inner City Baptist Church. You can register for that event. It's a free event at dbts.edu/rice. This year's lecture is going to be a debate between the historic and trauma-informed biblical counseling positions. If you're interested in biblical counseling, I think this would be a great event for you to check out. With that, let's welcome Dr. Dunham to the podcast. Dr. Dunham, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we're talking a little bit about canonical closure formulas. This was a paper that you presented at ETS this year. And specifically, we're thinking about wisdom literature in Ecclesiastes. So you start out your paper and you talk about Ecclesiastes as being kind of an unorthodox book. And it's typically been very difficult to nail down. Why do you think scholars have had such a hard time kind of pinning it down? And then we were just talking about wisdom literature as a whole. It's difficult to fit into the overall the major canon.
Yeah, it's typically been seen as sort of an outlier. It's been called things like the black sheep of the canon or preeminently enigmatic. And a lot of the reason for that is the language of the book is strange. The themes seem dark at first reading. The author doesn't clearly identify himself, which is the case with a number of books in the Old Testament. But in Proverbs, for instance, if we silhouette it with Proverbs clearly identifies Solomon at the opening of the book and then Hezekiah later in the book, whereas Ecclesiastes doesn't overtly name its author. It uses a term that's often translated the teacher or preacher. I prefer to render it something like the convener, but it's this word kohelet, which comes from a word meaning to gather an assembly. So it raises all kinds of questions as to who's behind the book. Is it Solomon? Is it a Solomon-like author? Most commentaries coming out today date the book no earlier than the Persian period, which would be after the exile, so say the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, down to about 220 BC, which is as late as some evangelical interpreters are going, but it's an incredibly late date to be dating the book. So when did the book come? What was its provenance, meaning its literary context from which it emerged? How do we deal with these third-person statements about Kohelet? Like in chapter 7, verse 27, it says the teacher or Kohelet. So how do we deal with the voice behind the book? Is there one voice or two voices or more? And so these are the kinds of questions I was wrestling with in this paper.
Yeah, so there's three major camps, from what I'm understanding, about the dating of the book. So either it's Solomonic, times around Hezekiah and the post-exilic era, and then be the Hellenistic era. So that's right up until the time before Jesus has come.
Yeah, a couple centuries before.
What are some of the linguistic arguments for a later date? Are they using some of the features in Ecclesiastes to argue for that?
They are. There are a lot of unusual forms in the book of Ecclesiastes, and so that's something every interpreter, I think, has to wrestle with if you're looking at the text. And it uses syntactical forms that often occur in books like Esther or Ezra and Nehemiah. And so it led a lot of scholars to the conclusion that we're dealing with a late book. Franz Delitzsch had this famous statement where he said, if Solomon wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, then there's no history of the Hebrew language. And what he meant by that was the Hebrew of Ecclesiastes is so unique, it seems to be from a later time because of this linguistic profile. Now, these kinds of questions are incredibly complicated, and I think more recently the tide has been turning against, say, late 19th century, early 20th century scholarship, which has tended to see these as all late forms. And it's recognizing scholarship is that it's more complicated in the sense that there's a lot of factors going on. One is dialect, so there could be a different kind of Hebrew spoken in the north versus in the south of Israel, and that's pretty established that that's the case. It could be concerns with register, and register means, is this a formal kind of writing, or is this more of an informal, like how we would send a text versus maybe a more formal letter? We have different styles, and so there's registers that authors used. So what I'd like to see is a recognition that a lot of these so-called late forms probably have another explanation. And so in this paper, I was kind of diving into this idea that a lot of it derives from dialectical concerns. There seems to be a Northern Hebrew influence on the language of the book, and that accounts for its unique syntax and style.
Okay. So would that put it closer to the fall of Jerusalem then? So if there's migration happening, the language is moving south, how would that work?
Well, again, some of this is difficult to understand. I just read an article that is arguing that, for instance, the Song of Solomon is much earlier than typically understood because the Northern Hebrew actually is indicative of Solomon's actual time period. So in other words, there were Northern influences already at the time of Solomon, but some change did happen with the fall of the Northern Kingdom. So the historical situation would be during the reign of Hezekiah, the Northern Kingdom and its capital Samaria fall to the Assyrians, and a lot of scribes and refugees came south and came to Jerusalem, and there's archaeological evidence of the expansion of the city, a flourishing literary output, and so some construe some of the Hebrew changes in terms of northern scribes coming down to the south. And where I draw in this thread is I'm arguing that Ecclesiastes is intending to seal off the biblical wisdom corpus, and that if that's the case, the epilogue of the book bears evidence of literary framing that's connecting it to the beginning of Proverbs, and we'll get more into this, I think, but that some of that might account for the fact that northern dialectical influence happened after the fall of the Northern Kingdom in the reign of Hezekiah, because Proverbs can't be dated earlier than Hezekiah because of 25:1, which says the men of Hezekiah copied out these Proverbs. So
at least that section of Proverbs.
Yeah, so that section of Proverbs. So we have to conclude that the final form of Proverbs is no earlier than Hezekiah. I'd like to argue that it's maybe about the time of Hezekiah, but it's a scribe such as Agur in chapter 30. And so one of the other threads in this particular paper is I'm trying to argue that Agur has an intriguing affinity with the book of Ecclesiastes, and could he be sort of the mystery man who puts the final touches on the biblical wisdom corpus sub-collection within the canon, which would be Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes.
Yeah. So what then, would it be primarily that dialectic feature that points you to Hezekiah in that sense?
It's a number of dialectical forms that are indicative of Northern Hebrew. And in this commentary that I'm, Lord willing, finishing up in the near future, I argue there are about 15 ingredients of a Northern dialect in Ecclesiastes that show the marks of Northern or Israelian Hebrew, as it would be called now. So these are things like a non-elision of certain particles. So, for instance, sometimes in variations of Hebrew, they would combine words or shorten words. And sometimes in Ecclesiastes, we don't see that happening. That's called non-syncopation. Another would be the use of the relative conjunction. Normally, it's a Hebrew word that's a longer form, asher, and in Ecclesiastes, it's a shortened form, sheh, which is indicative of a northern dialect. So there are about 15 of these ingredients, which seem to suggest its unusual profile might have a dialectical influence.
So it seems like then the men in Hezekiah's court are taking the wisdom literature left by Solomon and are framing it in different ways to basically button up the wisdom corpus. That's the kind of the central argument?
That's sort of the central argument, and I sort of came to this conclusion somewhat reluctantly. When I began my study of Ecclesiastes, I was convinced that Solomon is the author, and I still am convinced of that. But when I came to the epilogue, things began to jump out at me that seemed to suggest that maybe this was framed in such a way as to seal off the wisdom corpus as well as a larger sub-collection. So I don't know if we want to get into this now, but the idea of the epilogue of the book frames Kohelet as an earlier figure. For instance, there are only 2 times in the book when the definite article is used in front of Kohelet to designate him as something of a distant figure. And that would be 727, says the Kohelet, and then in 12:8, where says again the Kohelet. That was one thing that seemed to suggest he's being looked at sort of from a distant vantage point. And then as I studied the epilogue really has 3 parts here, 9 and 10, 11 and 12, and 13 and 14. 13 and 14 allude to Deuteronomy, fear God and keep his commandments. That's really a reference to Deuteronomy 13:4. So the last part of the epilogue frames with Deuteronomy to connect the wisdom corpus to Torah. The middle part then, 11 and 12, frames with Proverbs. So here it's the words of the wise, and that's mentioned also in Proverbs 1:6, the words of the wise and their riddles. And then in verse 12, beyond this, my son, be warned, frames with the first speech of Proverbs, my son, when sinners entice you, do not consent. So it's my son plus imperative in both cases. And so this 11 and 12 seem to be a frame with Proverbs. And then 9 and 10 seems to be a frame with Kohelet, that is the teacher, Solomon, who's behind the main part of the book. And 9 and 10 specifically shine a spotlight on Kohelet as a teacher and as an arranger of Proverbs. And so what I'm arguing is that there are concentric circles that this epilogue functions to frame Torah, to frame the wisdom, Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes, and then to frame the book itself, and that it's intentionally put there as a way of sealing off this corpus. And this sort of ties into a larger argument that's going on in scholarship right now about this idea of sub-collections, which essentially argues that when parts of the canon were closed, there tended to be epilogues or statements that sort of sealed off those smaller parts. Think, for instance, of the book of Deuteronomy. At the end of the book of Deuteronomy, it elevates Moses. It points to an eschatological conclusion. It talks about the trustworthiness and authority of his writing and his words as a prophet. Similar thing happens at the end of the Gospel of John to seal off the canonical Gospels, that he says, this is the disciple who testifies about these things. A similar thing happens in Revelation. So what I'm arguing is that if we call these canonical closure formulas, that something similar is happening in Ecclesiastes, and that this canonical closure formula is the end of Ecclesiastes, and it's pointing beyond the book itself to incorporate the 3 wisdom books, which are Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. And I know my answer here is long, but another thread being the fear of the Lord, because the fear of the Lord begins in Proverbs. It's literally the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom in 1:7. In Job, it's the midpoint of the book. It's in chapter 28 where can wisdom be found? Well, it's the fear of the Lord, chapter 28 says, so it's the midpoint. And then in Ecclesiastes, it says, the end of the matter, all has been heard, fear God and keep his commandments. So what I'm arguing is that the fear of the Lord is a through line that starts in Proverbs, reaches its midpoint in Job, and concludes the matter in Ecclesiastes, and that this through line encapsulates what the wisdom enterprise, the biblical wisdom enterprise consists of, which is fearing God from beginning to end.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have a couple of follow-up questions. First one, which should be a shorter one. Why not include Song of Solomon in the wisdom literature? Why do you divide it up as, I understand the through line there for the books, but why exclude that one?
I guess I would say I'm still open to being convinced one way or the other.
Okay.
I've talked to one of my friends who's a Song of Songs scholar, Tim Little, out at Faith in Ankeny, and he argues that Song of Solomon is a wisdom book. My caveat is the fear of the Lord isn't specifically mentioned in the Song of Solomon. So to my mind, that's kind of the litmus test. Is the fear of the Lord a prominent theme? If I don't see it as a prominent theme, I'm reluctant to say it's a wisdom book. So the way I frame it is sort of like a Venn diagram of there's a wisdom collection, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes. There's a Solomonic corpus, which is Proverbs, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes. And they overlap in the middle with Solomon, but Song of Songs seems still to me to be an outlier. Now I know that you can make a case that it is a wisdom book. Miles of Impelt and others have argued for that, and I still I suppose reserve judgment about that. It's possible we could incorporate that because it clearly does have Solomonic themes. And in the introduction to this commentary on Ecclesiastes, I have a section about how Ecclesiastes pairs with Proverbs and how Ecclesiastes pairs with Song of Songs. So I do see a thematic connection there, specifically in Ecclesiastes 9:7-9. Enjoy life with the wife whom God has given you is lived out in Song of Songs, as I see it.
Right. But that would be because of the authorial the authorship connection there
Primarily,
through Solomon. Yeah. Okay, so then as we think about the epilogues to these books, you're arguing then basically that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes up until, is it 12:8?
12:7 is what I concluded, yeah.
Okay, so up until 12:7, and then 7 through 14, verses 7 through 14.
8 through 14.
8 through 14 are added later.
As an epilogue.
Yeah. Is that a problem for a general view of inerrancy of the Scripture, inspiration through the author? What are some of the problems that could come up with that?
Yeah, so I think a potential problem would be some would argue, well, you're sort of giving into what's called redaction criticism, which means books were sort of in flux and they were constantly being updated and changed over time. So, Michael Fishbane, for instance, would argue that the books of the canon were constantly being updated even until the modern era, the Greco-Roman period. And so all these books were in flux. And I'm not suggesting that. What I am suggesting is that the evidence of the Old Testament seems to suggest that in several cases there was a preliminary canonical form of books and a final canonical form of books. Proverbs is sort of a parade example because clearly you have Solomon as the author, and yet 25:1 says these are the Proverbs that Hezekiah's scribes copied, Hezekiah having come some 250-ish years after Solomon, and so there must have been an early and later form. Psalms would be similar. So in these cases, what this means is the preliminary canonical form is written by a writer of inspired Scripture. The final canonical form is completed by a writer of inspired Scripture. So both writers partake of divine inspiration as part of the process. It's just that there's a multi-stage formation. And so Proverbs is an example that I'm sort of applying to Ecclesiastes based on what I'm seeing in the epilogue.
Yeah. Do you? I think if I remember correctly from looking at your paper, you make a point about the making of many books, there is no end, is also tied into the idea that this is the close of the wisdom corpus.
Right. So this is an older idea that I came across, and I had already sort of concluded on this, but the question is raised by some interpreters, what exactly is he warning? So this is in 12:12, beyond these, my son, be warned. What are the these? Well, in the context, it's the words of the wise in verse 11 and their collections of proverbs. So clearly he's not saying, you should read no other books beyond this, because he himself says at the beginning of the book that he searched everything under heaven. So he was gaining wisdom by reading everything. What it seems rather to be saying is these are the divinely sanctioned words and writings. That is, they're given by one shepherd, as he says here, which I take as one shepherd being a testament of divine inspiration, and that he's not to go beyond the divinely sanctioned books. In other words, it's sort of putting God's seal of approval on these biblical wisdom books as partaking of divine inspiration and therefore having divine authority. And so the warning here is not necessarily don't read any other books, but recognize that no other books have the same authority that these books have. So these books are supreme in terms of the wisdom corpus and thinking through them. And incidentally, I also, in this paper and elsewhere, have argued that in verse 12, where it says, the making of many books has no end, that is something very similar to what the end of the Gospel of John says when it says there that, if all the things were written about Christ that could be written, I suppose the world itself could not contain all the books. In other words, it's a very similar statement there saying, there's no end to what we could say. This is what we have said. Therefore, Scripture is sufficient and it's authoritative. So that's kind of how I read these statements.
Yeah. That's how I feel about reading for my THM paper. There's no end to what you could read.
Exactly.
But what do you actually need to read?
Right.
Good. So with the connection then of the wisdom literature to Torah, how do you think that connection helps us read both sections of Scripture better?
Yeah. I would say it's really important to understand that Proverbs is, and the wisdom corpus in general, so Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, are really a practical extension of Torah in the sense that they take the theology of Deuteronomy and show what that looks like in terms of regular life. That is, in your day-to-day life as you're walking in the market and in the fields and in the city, what does it mean to live out Torah? And that these books are sort of like a practical extension of it. Now, that's very evident in the book of Proverbs, and a lot of dissertations and monographs have been written about connections between Deuteronomy and Proverbs, specifically Deuteronomy 6, where it says when you're walking in the way, when you lie down, when you're sitting, you're to meditate and to teach Torah to your children. And Proverbs picks up on that in terms of its pedagogy in the first 9 chapters, where a lot of the similar terminology is used about teaching wisdom to your children and so on. And so there's a Deuteronomic theme that casts its shadow quite extensively over Proverbs. And I would argue that it also does over Ecclesiastes, even though this is under-recognized and underdeveloped. So Deuteronomic themes are also critical here because it influences and shapes the book quite a bit. So it helps us because it shows that wisdom isn't secular. It's not divorced from theology. It's not sort of like, what if we bracketed God out of the picture and just sort of lived a successful life? What would that look like? That's not what wisdom is saying. It's saying, how do we live a theocentric life that's pleasing to God, but to do so in the practical marketplace of everyday life?
Right. Because the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, right? It's built on an understanding of who God is and how that then, if God exists, how I should live that out.
Right. Yeah.
So you point to Agur as a possible editor here for writing the epilogue. What's the connections to Solomon? What moves you in that direction?
Yeah, so I've been intrigued, and so one of the themes I'm developing as I've studied the book of Ecclesiastes more is this intriguing possible connection to Agur. The name Kohelet, or the teacher in Ecclesiastes, means the gatherer, and Agur means the gathered one. So they both have a name affiliated with gathering. In fact, medieval Jewish rabbis argued that both were pseudonyms for Solomon because they both talk about gathering. So if we think of Kohelet as the gatherer and Agur as the gathered one, that almost suggests a teacher-disciple kind of relationship. The gatherer has gathered his student and has taught his student. And then beyond that, I've read dissertations and journal articles that argue that Agur, as an intriguing figure, seems to have affinities and connections to Northern Israelite Hebrew, which I've been arguing is part of the linguistic profile of the book of Ecclesiastes. And so and then there are about 7 other things. They both enjoy riddles. They have a view of divine sovereignty that's very similar, a view of epistemology that's very similar. They're both chastened in their epistemology. So Agur says, I'm too brutish to be a man. And Kohelet is very much, I looked to search for wisdom, and it is far, far off. Who can master it? So both really recognize that there's a lot that we can't know. They both talk about wisdom as the appropriate middle course between extremes, and there are a number of other things as well. But they have these intriguing thematic and theological affinities, which in my mind is a possible link to help explain how Ecclesiastes comes to be in its final form.
Yeah. So with these connections to the rest of the wisdom literature and to the Torah, if someone was going to preach through, we've already talked about preaching through Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, how does thinking about the thematic connections in this way help someone think about how they might preach through either this section or the book as a whole as they think about it that way?
I would suggest that we look and interpret and teach and preach these books not in isolation from one another, but as conversation partners. So in other words, it's become typical to sort of take a very negative view of Ecclesiastes, that it's a jaded skeptical book that's sort of looking at what's the best humans can do under the sun. And I'm trying to recover a positive or sympathetic reading of the book, which essentially suggests that a major theme is finding joy in a fallen world and how we can pursue that. And I think if we read that in conversation with Proverbs tells us that all things being equal, generally, if we follow these principles, life works out well, we succeed and flourish. Ecclesiastes seems to be saying, even if you do all the right things, sometimes it doesn't actually produce a favorable outcome. So in one sense, it sort of brings Proverbs into the real world, understanding a fallen world matrix. On the other hand, Ecclesiastes can also, I think, temper some of Proverbs, and then also it can help us to see that a lot of the wisdom in Ecclesiastes is also positive, like Proverbs. So I'm thinking of chapter 7, where there's a lot of proverbial wisdom given, which does have a positive framework in many ways. So I think, anyway, there's a value to reading these books together as complementary and as conversation partners, and then also bringing Job in and seeing how they really offset each other. So I would just argue that biblical wisdom is complementary rather than antithetical, so we should read them in unison and in concert rather than pitting one against the other.
Right. Because it has been, people tend to view Ecclesiastes as a skeptical book. And I don't mean like skeptical about the book, but it just tends to have a negative outlook on life.
Right.
But seeing them together helps, I think, counteract some of that, like what you're saying.
Yeah, I think so. I think it helps to read them in the right way as God intended us to see them as a unified subcollection.
Yeah, good. Well, I know this was a little bit more technical of an episode, but I think it was helpful as we think about wisdom literature and its connection to the Pentateuch that way. So thank you, Dr. Dunham, for coming on the podcast.
Thanks. Yeah. All right.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Theologically Driven. If it was helpful, I'd encourage you to share it with someone who might also get value out of this. You can also subscribe to our podcast on whatever platform you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of the episodes. Theologically Driven is a podcast of Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. If you'd like to learn more about our seminary, you can go to dbts.edu.